Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and here we are again. So, is there a German way of war? If so, where did it come from? What impact did it have on the Third Reich's early victories and later defeats? Unraveling it all via Clausewitz, Schlieffen, the Kaiser, and AH himself is Dr. Philip W. Blood. The governor is back. So I'll bring him back in now. France calling Germany. France calling Germany. Good evening, Dr. Blood. How are you today?
Good Abend. Yeah, well, I'm very well and looking forward to having a chat with you guys again. And,
good.
I like that introduction. That was very cool.
Thank you. And we were just talking before going live. I feel I'm getting more people contacting me on the channel now who want to talk about the development of things over years. I mean, I still get I want to talk about this battle on June 1943. People are looking now at how we've done one on artillery and which you liked, how that developed. We did with Jamie on Sunday about the French Air Force plan through the 30s and the 40s. And I think there is a bit of a renaissance in looking at where these things that we think we understood come from. And as Jamie Graham said yesterday, or someone, it was Jamieson Sunday. He used the word blitzkrieg, but didn't really like using the word blitzkrieg. But the point is, we all think we know what is meant by the word blitzkrieg, and so it kind of places a bit of time and place. But as you'll be explaining, there's a lot to this whole German thing. So, folks, without further ado, I shall put up Dr. Blood's slides, and I'll hand over to the governor to take us through this. Please fire away with comments and questions. But as you know, a lot of the stuff will be covered as Dr. Philip Blood takes us through it. So over to you, sir.
Okay, well, and thank you for having me again, as I said, and welcome everybody. And I just want to say all the very kind remarks I've had since I was ill the other time. Really, thank you very much, everyone. So I'm going to start with this first slide, which is a combination of a couple of books that I particularly like. Gerhard Gross in particular, The Myth and Reality of German Warfare. I mean, both of these books have been in my collection since they were first published. I don't entirely agree with everything they say, but if I was to say, where would you start for this kind of subject, I would begin with those two books. I've used the Prussian statue from the battlefield of Waterloo to show the Iron Cross and the Prussian background. And then to the far right is the copy of a Nazi statue of the Wehrmacht. It's symbolic of the Wehrmacht. And so technically I'm going to be treading between these two. I'm just going to say that this is my interpretation of the German way of war. I would say there's many, but this is going to be mine, and based upon, as I said to you before, Woody, at the end we're going to announce the new book. And some of the points treading through this are going to be aspects of the research which shapes the book, and partly explains why I have perhaps a different view to the German way of war than to my eminent peers, Robert Citino and Gerhard Gross. So if we move on. So I haven't put that there to advertise Substack, although I will advertise Substack. I put it there because I'm often claimed not to be anti-Clausewitz. I'm not anti-Clausewitz. I'm anti the fact that Clausewitz dominates all the military thinking. And for me, in the kind of history that this book and my work has been about, German history, Clausewitz is really not a very good model for my kind of work. It's not national or cultural in his way. And he's talking about how you're going to progress with war, how you're going to do it in the future, how you're going to fight your wars. For a historian, we have to look at things slightly differently. We're looking at the past, maybe making projections about the future, but really kind of buried in the past and in records. And so I made this Substack statement that, Clausewitz, the alibi of the nation, that's simply because in all the research I've done, he rarely turns up until they get to the end when they've lost the war. And of course, they lost the war because they didn't follow what Clausewitz told them to do, which, that's always the problem. And that hindsight thing is very common in the historiography. So if we could just move. So as people will know by now, I tend to like to focus on individuals, people. And in this case, a lot of my research has been on the ordinary soldier, not particularly working class soldier, although I've focused on some of them, but the ordinary soldier. And I've often asked this question, why did the German military system repeatedly normalize extreme violence? Now, in the book that I'm writing, it's only a small part. So what I've done is, for the talk, I've elevated aspects of military history, which isn't so prominent in my book. I'm more of a total German history in the 20th century, and sort of combine the two. And in this talk, we're going to be looking at doctrine, and I mean doctrine here in how the military thinks, or how the German military thought at the time. In terms of lethality, I'm looking at how the military compensates for structural weakness. That's a strange way of looking at lethality, because you think it's how to kill people more efficiently. Well, yes, it is, but it's also covering up usually weak problems. And the more lethal an army gets, it's obviously at some point disguising a more structural problem. And I'll explain that as we go on. Ideology, of course, is the politics that shapes military objectives, strategy, and regimes. And now I deliberately dropped culture a step, because I know whenever I've talked about culture in the past, it's created a lot of critics. Now here I'm talking about how war was justified and remembered in military circles. So the culture I'm using here is not some kind of social history culture, but more about the military use of culture. So if we just move on. So I felt obliged, because we're going to be talking about some quite extreme things in German history. I felt obliged to write this, and I'm not going to read it, just give it a moment for people to take on board. The fact of the matter is, I'm very concerned that even today, we're still having to be concerned about denial of the Holocaust and all the horror that goes on. So I wanted to make a strong statement at this point to say, this is my opinion, and my talk is historical analysis. I'm not advocating any of this Nazi stuff or German stuff that we talk about. I do not deny the Holocaust. I do not deny the exceptionalness of Auschwitz. So, thank you. Should we move on? So, I'm actually kind of pitching this at the start after the Franco-Prussian War. And what I tried to do is to take a whole load of issues which in German military history we don't always see very obviously in World War II books. You hear about, oh, they built fortifications on the Eastern Front, the Panther Line, or they built the Festung Europa. What I found interesting when I was doing the research for my Aachen book was the fact that Cologne had constructed these forts between 1884 and 1891 and carried on using them, and they were very important to the German military system. As I focused on that, and if you can see, that's one of the Cologne forts on the western side of the Rhine, and there's about 15 of them, and they are incredibly impressive. This one I walked around, and it had been used by the Luftwaffe in the Second World War for anti-bomber operations, fighter defense and the Kammhuber line. It was linked to all of that. But there was also evidence that there'd been strong fighting there. And as I spoke to a local historian who's been regalvanizing this history, he says, he really doesn't get very much interest in it. He was saying just how important this was, and he's got a fantastic collection of photographs showing just how important this was to the German military system right the way through from the 1880s. So that kind of pushed me to say, well, what is Germany? Well, it's Imperial Germany of a whole load of states, many of which have been fighting Prussia. So Prussia, at the end of the 1815 war, has occupied the Rhineland. So you've got states which have been occupied by Prussia, and you've got states which have fought with Austria against Prussia. So in the living memory of the First World War, there's many generals and many soldiers and families who are not particularly happy with the Prussian system. And so you have this Kaiser running this organization and trying to do nation building, while at the same time, you find strands and ideas about how you're going to defend the fatherland if the French come back or whoever. So while there are these incredible doctrines for offensive warfare, which came out of the Moltke school book and Schlieffen, you've also got a defensive warfare. And the other problem for the German army is you've got all these different armies like Hesse, Bavaria, the Rhineland regiments. They're not unified. There's a sense of unification in that they're all working to various plans, but they are federated armies. And that makes Germany a very interesting story leading up to the First World War. Now, if you take that back to the Kaiser, he's running a garrison state in a sense that German society is slowly grinding towards constant mobilization, massive reserves, as generals come along with ideas of how they're going to fight wars. And this particular Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was noticed, pushed himself forward as some kind of charismatic chieftain in the old Germanic sense. And he combined hunting and soldiering. And you can see here, he's got his hunting clothes on and his sort of squirrel or something he's killed. He's vehemently anti-British. But the thing about this man, which, there's all the discussions about the smashed hands and all the rest of it, but that number is a telling number on my left-hand side of him. And that is the number of animals that he killed in his lifetime. And that's a number, and at which point does mass killing of animals lead to other issues, other tendencies? That's that. Now, I'm not going to bore everybody with hunting, but hunting is important, so I left that there. Anyway, let's move on.
Just a quick question, because you've already used the word German and you've used the word Prussian, and I find that sometimes we use those words interchangeably, or we're trying to make a point. So Trevor is saying, was there a German military system, or was it more of a Prussian system imposed on the rest of German culture?
Well, it's a bit of both. And what I found interesting about the Schlieffen plan was I found a Bavarian plan. And, there's a lot of the histories focus on the Prussian elements, like the soldiers, Hindenburg, Schlieffen, and these guys. There's tendency to follow the Prussian story. But these other stories are a lot more fascinating. For me, I've actually chosen to go down the Bavarian route. I wasn't going to allude to it very early, but my emphasis of the new book is the Bavarian army and Bavarian professionalism. It will sneak through as we go through. And maybe I'll be able to answer the question a little bit better as we go on. I'm a bit conscious of time.
No, we'll just keep going. We're loving it.
Okay. So we all study German history at some point at A level or wherever, and we all come to the conclusion that 19th century is this great industrial power, which has combined Prussian militarism and Rhinelandish industrial power into this unique military industrial system. Now, I'm using system instead of the military industrial complex, because the military industrial system here in Germany in the period up to the First World War is very much industry, whereas when you get to the complex of science and every way in which with atomic nuclear weapons and all the rest of it, with the German military system, the industrial side is almost on a par with the military. So you have families like the Krupp who can dictate to a certain extent, how the military are going to fight, because they're going to produce the guns to make you fight. So it's a very interesting model that the military-industrial system is determined by this balance between military and industry. But to feed the military with the weapons it needs as an industrial army, it has a deep strategic predicament, which is raw materials, and it's a huge weakness. And so what you find from the 1890s are various explorers going out looking for raw materials in the reaches of the colonies, because Germany has this grave concern that their industrial model is going to fail. Now, in the same time as that's taking place, obviously Schlieffen's coming along, making the plans together to win rapid war, because he knows that Germany can't go into a prolonged war with industrial power because he hasn't got access to the same raw materials that any other country like Britain and France. So there is this dilemma, and it's raw material based. And the reason why I put the two pictures with Kaiser and Hitler there, that is the one thread, if you like, the golden thread that runs through from almost 1815 right the way through to 1945. That these two men and others see the importance of encouraging Krupp to arm them, and they have different ways. It's very interesting how the Kaiser has a more personal touch, and Hitler has his, lofty aloofness. Anyway, let's move on. So we come to something which a lot of the military histories tend to forget, which is Germany's colonial wars before 1914. And the issue here is, I've picked this one. I could have picked what happened in China when Kaiser in 1900 for the Boxer Rebellion ordered the troops to take no mercy or pardon from Chinese who surrender, was to just kill them. Here we have another uprising, which in 1904 led to this huge battle at the Waterberg in Namibia. I'm showing this for various reasons. One, because what you actually have is the field armies in battle groups, flying groups at that stage, but we'll understand them as Kampfgruppe, fighting at different points, and the numbers are the numbers of machine guns and their positions of the machine guns of the various Kampfgruppe to force the Herero, who are in red, towards the desert. And now there's different arguments. Some saying that the German commander tried to envelop the whole of the Herero and take them out in one decisive kill. Others said it was to force the Herero to run into the desert and then die by natural wastage, which is a common theme in German military history, and it will come again. So what you actually have to see there is various views of how you see that battle. Now, for the British were amazed that the Germans had took so long to put themselves into these tactical positions in preparation for the battle. So what you actually have at the same time as this battle is taking place, historically, is you've got the German records in the colonial amp saying this, that, and the other. And my great friend Jürgen Zimmerer, the German historian of Namibia, writing about this battle and other activities. But I actually went to the British archives and found remarkable observations of the British reporting on this battle. So you get I got two perspectives, and one that came out, which went into my PhD research, was the Kriegsetappen, which is this rear area function which works to support the German army, but also brings military government with it. It is an exceedingly complex organization. And what you find in Namibia is the two of them work together. Now, when I tracked it back, obviously I was wondering when the Etapa took this political role in military operations, and it was actually in Alsace. So from 1872 right the way through to 1904, the Etappen had worked out how to run occupation. So you've got a very clever governmental system for running war. And then, of course, with the colonial violence, what you actually see is this different stage. You can, if you compare it with the Boer War, there's extremes with Kitchener and the concentration camps and forcing people to die slowly. So it's not like this is done in a vacuum. This is Germany on its own. The global powers, the great powers, in their efforts to control their empires, are doing quite extreme things. But what the Germans do is to take this doctrine, which is the encirclement, you know, the Cannae maneuver, which is so deep and memorable in the Schlieffen thinking of military operations, and have applied it against the tribes. And that quite shocked the British. And if we go on to the next slide, I'll explain the man who. So the German army has regular maneuvers, the Kaiser maneuver, and these are pictures from 1912. And as you can see, in terms of today, obviously it looks pretty antiquated stuff, Zeppelins and, you know, fold up aeroplanes and steam tractors. But for its time, that's as advanced as the German army is marching into France in 1940. And what I found quite interesting, and you can see it's center of the research of my book, was the fact that I trawled through, when I was still a member of the Royal United Services Institute, I trawled through all their papers from 1870 right the way through to 1914. And this man here to the right, Colonel Lonsdale Hale, had actually monitored the German army from 1872, when the Etappen was first used in Alsace, right the way through to 1914, and died in the year of the war. So what's important here is you see that the German army is pushing the industrial way of war, while at the same time has a strategic predicament, while at the same time trying to quickly resolve colonial uprisings in Namibia to maintain its supply of raw materials. So you've got all of these pressures coming onto the German way of war, and it's changing its direction and forcing it to think about how it's going to move into, you know, various stages of planning. Is it going to go towards France? Is it going to Russia? I mean, it's not an easy situation to assume that just because war starts in 1914, there's Schlieffen plans going to take place. There's all of this activity going on behind, making the German army not as certain as people have always thought that they would be. So if we move on. So here we are. The Schlieffen plan we know fails. I call it the Schlieffen system failure. They stress test the system in war, and that's not an issue for me. I think soldiers of any armies want to stress test their capability, because how do they know whether they're doing things right unless they put it into actual operation? So I can understand why soldiers want to do this stuff. And what happens is, of course, Schlieffen is not around when the war starts. But as we well know, there's this impression of mass which is coming down on what was supposedly his plan, amended or otherwise. And what I found when I started to read the Bavarian army was a different kind of situation going on with a professionalism. And if I could just say for a second, the guy in the middle who's got the Iron Cross got very badly wounded in a battle at Wiesenbach near Strasbourg on the 24th of August, 1914. And he's an artillery officer, and he had a few guns when the French mass, like the German mass in that picture, the French mass came over the hill and caught him by surprise. And his supporting infantry regiment with his battery of guns were caught exposed, and he had to run the battle. And the sense of professionalism when I read the report was quite amazing. It reminded me there's the story of the King's, I think it's the Royal Horse Artillery, where they fight a battle in 1914 and hold the line and fighting to the last gun, that story. This was a very similar situation. The man in the middle is a guy called Georg Escherich, and he was a captain at that stage, and he'd been in the reserves for 22 years, up to the point when the war started. And he's come back from having done a survey in the Cameroon for the Cameroon rainforest, entirely for raw materials, and got launched straight into a war, shown his bravery, got severely wounded, and is taken out of the battle. But for that little slot of papers in his family records, I found this amazing story about his battle. I was quite impressed with the way he performed. So we move on. So as the German army begins to stall, we know that it's driven down, and I think I took you to Welkenrath, where the small monument was for the people who'd been murdered by the German army as it marched into the Belgian towns back when you came with the lads.
Yeah.
And John Horn and Alan Kramer have studied that book, German Atrocity, those atrocities, German Atrocities, Dynamics of Destruction. And of course, I'm forever told that I don't like Isabel Hull. I absolutely adore Isabel Hull's book, Absolute Destruction. It just at times doesn't really fit with the work that I'm doing. So I leave her out sometimes, not simply because I don't want to be saying she doesn't fit, but actually it's one of the best books of this subject, which I think is very, very useful for anybody. So, you know, you've seen the tranche of books that I've used in the past for my Aachen book and for developing things. I would just say with John Horn and Alan Kramer's book, the thing that I noticed when I went to study the subject with War Comes to Aachen, they didn't put Aachen regiments in that line to go down the Belgian villages because I think they knew that locals wouldn't kill locals. I think the men of Kelmis, if you remember, I took you to the church of Kelmis, where the German community was, which is now in Belgium. Many of those men were not killed in that area. And that's simply because they were put further, the regiments from that area, from the Aachen area and around, were put further out. So the Prussian army did the most of the damage. Now, what's interesting here is this is the electric fence between Belgium and Holland, which I write about in the book. The reason why it's there is because as Germany is now enforcing an extreme occupation on the Belgians are trying to escape into Holland. So they build this fence, literally an electric fence, all the way down the border between Belgium and Holland to prevent people from escaping, because they're enforcing strict, almost slave labor type conditions on the population. So again, you know, we're getting back to that colonialism in Europe kind of scenario. And what's very interesting is these electrical wiring systems were plugged in to German cities, and the German cities were monitoring the flow of electricity. So for example, in Aachen tramway was supplying electricity for these fences and monitoring the regulation of the current. So, you know, you've got to look at the German way of war here. It's not just the army, it's how civil society supports the army. So it's not just, you know, pushing the mobilization, everybody being in reserves for as long as possible, a garrison state. It's also that the municipalities are functioning to support the military. So if we move on. So after the Battle of Tannenberg and the failure to win rapid victory and the Kaiser's reluctance to lead, we get a situation where Ludendorff and Hindenburg effectively become a military dictatorship. And what I found interesting in my research on this subject was not so much how doctrine and ideology led to dogma, because, yeah, we know that's what actually happened, but how this military dictatorship was being reflected amongst the ranks of the other royals. So if you like, the Kaiser has failed, but you've got all this federation of kings and princes and monarchs. And in my research of looking at how German royalty was responding to how the German army was performing in the First World War, you hear from Bavarian princes and kings, monarchs, and Hessians and Saxons, they're really not happy with what the Kaiser has done to allow Hindenburg and Ludendorff to take that stance. They think there's more other effective officers. So it's very interesting that when you start looking at German military records from a different perspective, this time royalty, which really wouldn't have been my way in the past, but I was required to look at it because of the people I will be dealing with, and we're going to discuss that very minute, is just how the military dictatorship was pretty much frowned on. And the compensation for being frowned upon was for the royals to literally live like kings while the nation was in rations. Now, I haven't put a slide in here about the hunger period, but during the hunger period, when the German people were having to live in the soup kitchens, the German royals were living right royally. So, and then after the war, of course, they said, we starved like the rest of you, which is blatantly not true. And I was going to put some menus in to show people about the, Chateau Margaux and the nice fine wines these royals were drinking and eating. But anyway, we move on.
We did have a quick question from Terry about Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Were they already dictators by late 1940? What about Falkenhayn, chief of staff until 1916?
I think Falkenhayn was before Ludendorff and Hindenburg taking over. Given the time and space, I just leapt from the major themes to I should have put Falkenhayn in there.
Okay, you can't include everything. You're taking us on about 40 years of German history in one evening, so don't beat yourself up. I
did miss that because he's actually a very important player, and of course he leads the idea of attrition to Verdun. But in the thesis I'm trying to show here, it's not so much German soldiers dying in action, in the same way that the SS will do in the Second World War. I'm really trying to show how German war making is flexing and changing and shifting to cope with the challenges it's facing, and that's not necessarily just the Allies.
Yeah, and I think one of my key takeaways from spending time with you in Aachen is that the whole German practices of World War II, you can't just start in 1939. You can't even start in 33. You've got to go back and fill in all these gaps that you're doing there, because it's evolution, not revolution, in some sort of way, which is what you're kind of reminding us today. So so thank you. But moving on, as you say.
So I didn't know which should have come first, the Tannenberg battle or the military dictatorship. I put the military dictatorship first just because command always goes before battles, all the rest of it. So very early on, Ludendorff and Hindenburg are responsible for the Battle of Tannenberg. They win it. Previous generals fail. There's a whole story there. Dennis Showalter's book, a great historian, sadly passed now. It's one of the best books on the battle. He spent a lot of time talking about the lower officer there, Max Hoffman, who wrote rude memoirs about Hindenburg after the First World War, and therefore his memory has been kind of cast aside. The one above him is Hermann Geyer. Hermann Geyer is one of Ludendorff's, what I would call, professional managers of violence. He's very much behind these infiltration tactics, and we see a stormtroop unit here. The interesting thing about the stormtroops, if you compare it with what's happening with the Allies, the stormtroops reflect the lack of resources in terms of raw materials available to German army as the war comes to a crunching point. The nation is already trying to resalvage ores and irons and you know, melting stuff down and taking ladies' hair and all kinds of salvage calculation. But what you see with the stormtroops is a very subtle response to what the Allies have done. I mean, the Allies have come with tanks and new aircraft and so forth. What the Germans have responded to that by coming up with infiltration tactics using basically light infantry to break into the line, smash their way through, and then force an operation, which of course we know leads to the great big battle in 1918. That is a response. That is a very, very clever response to a strategic issue. And as the problem of raw materials and supply becomes more and more acute, the Germans are coming up with these unique ideas of how to resolve their strategic plight. And I think the stormtroop is a good example of that kind of situation. So if we move on, of course, stormtroops create an identity, and this is where I would say where one of the first stages of culture kicks in, and that's the cultures of lethality. Because if you look at the stormtrooper, he's presenting a form of killing which is nothing like the soldiers of 1914. There has been a huge change in the form and format of the German army. And even Richthofen there with his pour le mérite, he's also showing himself in this culture. What's interesting is if you read Feldposts, and Leo Pachman here, I collected back in the 90s old German postcards and Feldpost brief cards. And this Leo chap wrote to his friends saying, you know, with his medal and everything, saying, now look at me. And it's almost like he was perfect for this screen, this slide, because I wanted to show how someone has responded to the way they've changed. He went to war in 1914, and then he sent a postcard to his friend saying, now look at me, meaning I have changed. I really just wonder what he must have looked like in 1914. But anyway, in this process of if you like, culture of lethality, you get, of course, Ernst Jünger and the famous Storm of Steel, but also there's another side to it, which is the painting by Otto Dix, which is, you know, the stormtroopers fighting a gas attack, kind of an anti-war, even though there is a culture of lethality there, it's pretty much an anti-war. So this concept is grinding through the gears in Germany with different people seeing different ways. There are those who are anti-war, and we know Erich Remarque, and we know Otto Dix, and we know those who are pro-war, like Goering and Ernst Jünger. And anybody who wants to know about the fantasies that went through the minds of these boys, please read Klaus Tieveley's book, because it's a roller coaster. Anyway, let's move on. So we get to the heart of what I'm researching. Now, some of you will remember that in Birds of Prey, a talk I gave you some years ago for my book, it all took place in a place called Białowieża in Poland. It's a very famous Polish forest. In 1915, the German army occupied this forest and immediately set up a series of concentration camps and work schemes to extract the forest wood and the raw materials and use slave labor. And if you go through the three pictures, you've got the Jewish resin workers who, you know, cut the trees to get the bark resin out. you've got the women being used for some of the hardest work, building railways, and there they're using driftwood to make a fire, to bend the rails for the turns and twists and things that they have to do. The Germans made the women do the hard work because they wanted the men to cut the wood. The wood's the most important thing, but you don't put your best workers cutting the wood into railway work. You get the women to do that, and that there's a point when that became really quite harsh, especially in the winter of 1915. At the same time as you're reading the German military reports, in particular, I spent some time on the 41st Army Corps records, and there was huge numbers of German soldiers who were deserting. There was serious problem with Russian prisoners of war. There were partisan fights. So the image you get of this story of this camp is, it's not a simple case of colonial extraction. There is a huge amount of violence going on around it. Now, the man who opened up this, and became the commandant of this camp, is on the right with his newly minted Iron Cross from 1914, and that's Georg Escherich from the Bavarian Army. And the person next to him is Leopold, the Field Marshal of the Bavarian Army. And Leopold gave Georg the orders to set this camp up on the strength that Georg had been to the Cameroon the year before and had put the proposal up that the way to extract wood would be in a mass way with railways and cheap labor and blah, blah, blah. And Escherich basically took the Cameroon plan and plonked it into Poland. And I've called it Imperial German colonialism in Europe. Now, what you get with this is Escherich brings in his buddies within his clique. He's a forester by trade, as well as a soldier, and he brings the specialists in to do all kinds of woodwork. He brings in industrial firms, and at the end, they cut 33,000 fest meters of wood. And so I kind of went around asking, well, how big is a fest meter? Well, it's a 1 meter square cube of wood. And I said, well, 33,000 seems a lot. And the guy, the specialist woodman, said to me, yeah, you could almost go around the whole planet. And I thought, wow. And on that point, I then went to values. And this is how you suddenly see how exploitative colonialism is, because I just assumed a couple of marks for a square meter of wood or whatever. The value of the wood that they extracted was £2.8 billion in 1915 prices, which today, according to the conversion tables, would be £22 billion. That's phenomenal. Now, when you look at the sweat labor, and I use sweat labor because you're actually you're doing work, but you're only being paid to work with food. So you get, I don't know, 5 marks. That buys you soup, a bed for the night, and a breakfast roll in the morning. So sweat labor was pennies, marks, a couple of marks. But working it out in the numbers, given the numbers of people who are working there, each sweat laborer was earning upwards of 600 marks a year. So you can see the numbers and why the industries, and many of those companies, by the way, are still in existence in Germany, why this project was so important. And in 1919, as the war has come to the end and you're in the Armistice Commission discussions, Escherich and the industrialists are actually writing files which say, we've got to remember that war is a laboratory, that we've occupied wilderness, We fought against the British naval blockade, and in a future war, we have to defeat the British on their own terms, which is basically economic warfare. To actually have found a paper trail from 4 different German ministries, several German companies, and then these German officers from the Bavarian army writing these reports of 700 pages protecting the plans gives you an idea of how important this project was, even as the Allied Commission was coming into play to try and take away Germany's colonies. And just to give you an idea of how German archives work, if you look at the record plan of how the documents have been used over the period after 1919, there are recurring moments throughout the period, right the way up to 1939, when this file is being extracted and used and examined. So this isn't a project that goes away. This isn't. We did the project in Bielorussia, we did vile things. This is an ongoing project that maintains itself right the way through German military thinking and political thinking. One last thing, in 1919, a Jewish newspaper claimed that what happened to the Jews in this camp was unbelievable. They were putting barbed wire fences on. Several of the workers were picked up at night, taken into slave labor conditions, came home with very little money, emaciated, not properly fed. Many died. There was quite a number of Jewish workers' magazines between 1919 and 1923 complaining about this complex. So we get to Georg's brother, Karl, and Karl approaches the forestry problem from a different perspective. His attitude is what's destroying German wood are parasites, and that you have to kill the parasites. So it's a clever idea. You use gas to gas a tree, right? So the pictures on the left-hand side, or whichever you're looking at it, those are images of how you kill termites and bugs and beetles in a tree. In the First World War, he takes his fumigation ideas to keep armies clean. Well, that's really important work, because the German army, like any army, is suffering from typhus and other disease-related things. So you see a picture of German soldiers being led into a gas chamber to be fumigated, and they're wearing gas masks. Now, Paul Weidling and an Austrian lady, I remember her name, Maria, I met her in 1997. I can't remember the name. It's one of those oldie moments. But they talked about Jews and Polish civilians being put into these gas chambers without gas masks. And there's a great many stories of the gas chambers being used for purposes of coercion. That's an issue that's going to come around again and again. There's a major problem of why the Germans feel the need to punish the locals. It's not just that they're punishing the locals for being there and needing labor, but actually that extra coercion. And that's been difficult for me to work out. I mean, Paul and Maria have done an awful lot of work on it, but it exists. And I still haven't got that. That's probably the last little bit I need to finish in the research. So it is research for a new book. The new book isn't finished, so we'll call that bit the work in progress. But it's a dynamic moment. So if we move on. So in the period 1919 to 1933, you find these marriages of, I've called it political convenience. And Karl Escherich comes from his fumigation work in the Polish forests, where he's actually worked alongside his brother, fumigating the people who were kept in the camps, and they build saunas to clean these people, because Georg Escherich is desperate to keep labor going as long as possible to work the forest. Karl is keeping the disease out. So you've got the two brothers working in the same camps, working towards different missions, but to one sole purpose, which is to extract materials for the German army. Come 1919, Karl Escherich meets with Adolf Hitler. And Karl Escherich is one of Hitler's first followers, one of his earliest followers. So you suddenly see a shift, and his academic work starts to go towards something called political biology and the idea of socialist animal zones. And he particularly works on the termite and termite colonies, because they have a Führer, and then you've got all of this stuff, all of these little termites running around doing the work to the leader. And it's very interesting that Karl Escherich and Adolf Hitler come together at that time. Goering and Hitler come together at that time because Goering comes up with the idea there's such a thing as autarky, which is actually self-sufficiency in war. He's experienced the problems of shortages running the Richthofen circus, and he's come away from the war saying, if we're going to fight the damn British again, we have to fight them on their terms. And he convinces Hitler that the only way to go forward is with derivatives and substitutes. And some of the things that he's comes up with are like Buna, which we know about later with the rubber tires, and there's also the sugar used to create certain types of clothing with cellulose. Now, quietly, there's another marriage, and that's Hindenburg and von Rundstedt developing there. And the fascinating thing about the German army at this time is not so much all the doctrines it's going for, it's how much Hindenburg is preserving this hollowed out remains of the German army from the army that was from the end of the war, that power. So interesting little marriages, taking the subject forward. I have to say, as I've done an awful lot of work on Weimar and the impact of German economic warfare thinking in the Weimar period, and it's a lot different than's been studied in the past, as far as I'm aware.
Thank you.
Anyway, let's move on. So 1933, the marriages turn into power. Hindenburg and Hitler here in Sieg Heil. It's like they've combined. The army is the invisible hand behind the Nazi takeover of power. At some point, the army was instrumental in Hitler killing Ernst Röhm in 1934. Round about the time Hindenburg dies, then Hitler becomes leader. What's more interesting is one of Hitler's first appointments to Munich University as rector was Karl Escherich. And Hitler went to listen to his speeches about biological socialism, which obviously has links with Hitler's ideas, and to his last days in 1944, before he became somebody different, Karl Escherich continued to write about this subject from a political standpoint of the nature of a future German society, and the way you create and save a future German society is to take the parasites out. Move on. So I put this here because it was the first big display of militarism that I found in the Rhineland after Hitler came to power. Now, it's supposed to be a demilitarized zone in this area. This is Dusseldorf. And in 1930, it was under French control, and there had been all sorts of things going on. And Leo Schlageter was killed in a fight with the French, and so forth. Reason why I put this together was it was just amazing to see the Rhineland become a theatre of Prussian royalty. So you've got Otto Gebauer, who's famous for playing the part of Frederick the Great, being taken around as a reenactor of Frederick the Great, while the Crown Prince and von Mackensen and, you know, the one with the fluffy hat and others conducted all kinds of parades and military orders and military presentations. As I spent more time looking at this 4 days of military events and parades and return of militarism, and there are moments when the Nazis, like, as you can see, the picture of the SS man standing below the platform. This was all about reenacting, or if you like, recreating the Imperial German Army as was, all at one time, to restore the memory of the German Army. So it's not like we've not just had that for the last 10, 15 years. Now they're going to actually do it physically. And of course, film then becomes very instrumental in what the Nazis do. And of course, 1935, you have the Triumph of the Villains with Triumph des Willems with Leni Riefenstahl. And then Otto Gebauer is the lead in the next film, which of course displays Hitler's Führer principle, you know, the leadership principle at the highest moment. So the system has gone from being royalist to reactivating royalism to pushing monarchy and then putting it in film and making it last for eternity. It's a thread that needs to be further developed, but I just wanted to see, for people to see just how the Rhineland was shifting. It isn't a neutral zone. It's very much part of what's going on. So I'm not going to linger here because we talked about this before with the Rommel talk. So if anybody wants to reference it, all of these people, the 2 biggest pictures, Ritter von Epp, he goes from being an imperial soldier to a Nazi Reich leader. The 2 men in the middle, Rommel, goes from a ordinary imperial German army to Nazi army. The red box is a man called Balk, and we're going to talk about him later. The person looked to the stars, as gormless as ever, is von Paulus. Anyway, should we move on?
Yeah, so next set of slides. Here we go.
So I put this together because there's lots of ideas of how Hitler's strategic thinking and military leadership worked. And obviously, in much of the work that's been done on this, Jeffrey Megagi, the late Jeffrey Megagi, wonderful guy, counted the idea of how confused all of Hitler's workings were. And what I did was take a work model, business model, flowchart, just to show how Hitler has all of these people spinning around him. And it's very interesting. The last person to close the door on his room has left the decision behind. So whoever he talks to last, that person is going to give him the idea of the decision he's going to take. Well, it could mean anything. But in the scheme of things, if you look at it from across the whole threshold, you've got dominant people like Goebbels and Himmler and Goering at one end, and at the other end, you've got the military. And for a military commander like Guderian, he's got to go through a process to be able to get to Hitler. The only way he can get closer to Hitler, in my view, is to become more ideological than doctrine. And that's basically to follow the Nazi line. If you're going to achieve and you're going to get to that man, you have to get closer. And to get closer means you have to accept things that you wouldn't perhaps normally accept. Well, I don't know in Guderian's case. I think he would accept anything for power. But anyway, move on. So for me, the dominant soldier, again, since the First World War, has been the infantryman. And the German infantryman is reactivated in German military thinking again in terms of how the Nazi armies are going to come forward. Everybody is trained as, every man is trained as an infantryman. And whether that's in the Hitler Youth, where they do basic military field craft and all the rest of it, right the way up to when they're becoming a soldier, the first thing you learn is how to be an infantryman. And it shows, if you're listening to, or if you've read the memoirs of Hartmann, the Luftwaffe man, the Luftwaffe pilot, the famous ace, he starts in basic infantry training, and at one point during that infantry training was involved in fighting partisans. It's what happens. German soldiers are trained infantry first, and then the specialist comes afterwards. The thing about infantry training that's so important is that is where they start to create the popularity of the basic national training program, which is pushing guardianship, duty, and comradeship. Now, that's technically all good things, and that's for a military doctrine, but in ideology, they can be problematical. Yeah? So if we move on.
Just a quick question. You may be covering this later on, and Veronica asked this earlier in the show, but she said about the concept of obedience. Is that sort of a legacy going back to sort of the Napoleonic era and all through the eras you've been talking about, that there's this, the German soldier at its heart has this, you will follow orders. That sounds a cliched way of saying it, but is that continuity there?
Yeah.
And is that connected to the Prussians?
It's as strong in the Bavarian army as it is in the Prussians.
Right. Okay.
I would go back and say you need to have strong discipline to hold the kind of armies of the 19th century and the early 20th century together, because of the way they fought and the discipline that was required to make them fight the way. And that, I think they call it cadaver obedience. So it's like the obedience of the dead man to the order. You follow it straight. That it remains constant. But there are issues with that, because certain soldiers at certain times, as I discovered when I was doing Birds of Prey, a senior NCO, if he's got the authority, he can take over command and he can control with not quite the same obedience that you might have to give to an officer. So yes, it's a constant, and obedience in the German army isn't the same kind of obedience that you would think German people would oppose, but actually it feels comfortable.
Yeah, and I mean, it came up in the sidebar. It's still coming up about, when we talk about the British or the Australians or the New Zealanders fighting in the First World War, the Second World War for king and country, how different is that to Kaiser and country or Führer and country? But to me, there seems a difference, even though I can't necessarily put my finger on it. The British veterans I know, that obedience to a sort of a certain point, not to a blind point, if that makes sense. I know we're going into a massive, great rabbit hole of psychology and things, but there does seem to be a difference to me. Would you agree?
Yeah, disobedience happens in the German army. If you look at what Dave Snyder was looking at, sex crimes of the Wehrmacht, there was a great deal of criminal behavior which was against regulations, which shows that the German soldiers were not hidebound to rules and regulations to the point where they never broke the law, never broke the rules. So it's very difficult to say, or awkward to say, that the German army is any different from any other. What I would say is the discipline, they have faith in the discipline because it wins them a victory.
Right.
So if you fight and you win and the discipline is there and it works, then confidence in the discipline continues. Do you see what I mean? When what I noticed in 1918, when the German army started to fail and break down, there was no longer confidence. So if I remember reading one officer's record, he said, it didn't matter how many orders he gave, nobody was interested. They just gave up. We were not winning. Nobody was going to listen to what I said. No one was going to accept my orders. And I think there's a difference, and it's the tempo. If the tempo of victory is high, I think you can pretty much get away with the most extreme discipline. When things are breaking down, discipline disappears, you know.
Okay, thank you. Moving on.
So one of the problems, I know everybody likes to, or a large number of people like to talk about the panzer divisions and the Kampfgruppe and the armored warfare and all the rest of it. The problem with modern warfare's challenges are you have to decide what's more important, oil or fodder to feed horses. And with the German army, there is a huge problem, because while they might have 8,000 Mark IVs and 6,000 Sturmgeschütz, or whatever the numbers were, they have 3.3 million horses. That's a huge amount of fodder that has to be moved. Now, I had a colleague who spent an awful lot of time looking at the logistics, just of the fodder of the German army, and the numbers that he was coming out with were astonishing. So that gives you a two-speed army. And that's going to be a problem if the mobile side of the army outpaces or leaves behind the horse-drawn army. How do you coordinate the two? How do you coordinate a two-speed army? And I'm not sure that the German army ever coped with that problem, because it constantly relied on the infantry to fill the gap. Next. Okay. So I call it tip of the spear, just so you can see some tanks and panzer divisions and all of that.
About bloody time. You know, you've got your railways here. We need some bloody tanks. It's World War II TV, Dr. Blood. Give the public what they want.
Give the public what they want. So we've got the two vehicles which remain. So they're produced, you know, their design is from the 30s. They're still in action in 1945. There's a reason for that. One is that they're efficient, they do what was required, and yeah, the German army goes down the route of building Panthers and Tigers and all the rest of it. And you know, you read The Wages of Destruction by Adam Tooze or Richard Overy's War on the Economy. The big problem for the German army is always going to be scarcity of raw materials and the issue of managerial economics. Because on the one side, Krupp will say, okay, I will build you and continue to build you Sturmgeschütz of Mark IV all the way through to the end of the war. But I'm not prepared to spend the money to do something special. You think they are, because the story has always been about the modern wonder weapons and all the rest of it. But there's an inertia in an industrial army. So now, this is a crack point now. When I said the German army is an industrial army, yes, it is, born in the 19th century. And yes, it takes into developing new ideas which become useful in the first part of the Second World War, which they log into and use strategically very well. But they can't go very far. You know, you've constantly talked about in the past when we've been together or when you've been on shows, just the development in the British Army. And we did that when one of the questions you asked me about Stan, when we did Uncle Stan's thing. You asked me, you know, they're getting on with the fighting regardless of the weapons, and the new weapons haven't come in yet to make them better. The German army is coping with the same weapons in 1939 does in 1945. So the fundamental structure of the German army is pretty constant. There are going to be two changes, and I'll talk about them later. But what they produce at the start of the war that leads them into fighting the, I don't know, what do you want to call it? I suppose you call it Blitzkrieg or Bewegungskrieg or any of the good stuff. But those weapons that are generated now and constructed now are constructed for a purpose. And they are not going to be an army of panzer divisions. They're going to continue to be an army of infantry. That puts an incredible pressure on an army that is, in Hitler's mind, going to take over the whole of continental Europe and Russia. So if we Move on.
Yeah, thank you.
So I needed my trains for a moment, mostly to show here's another continuity. If the German army hasn't got enough panzer divisions and motorized formations to make it mobile, how does it make itself mobile in mobile maneuver warfare? Well, it uses trains. Railways and internal lines enable German strategy to have worked in the First World War perfectly. You know, before the Battle of Tannenberg, Ludendorff and Hindenburg jump on a train and go to fight the battle. Similar situations will happen in the Second World War with trains, and as you can see from the map, trains moving divisions from one place to another, almost within, not lightning speed, but given the average walking pace of a German infantryman being about 3 miles an hour, these trains moving at, I don't know, 40 miles an hour, there's a huge mobility opportunity there, which the railways facilitate. And we know that the railways are doing other things, but for this talk, we're only talking about their use in strategic military operations. So they go to war, and as you can see, it's the infantry that goes to war with a few panzer divisions. There's all the claims that the panzer divisions do all the fighting, but it's interesting how much the infantry are there doing their thing. What interests me about Poland in 1939 is how the Nazis themselves depict it. And as you can see, it's the infantrymen smashing down the frontier. This pamphlet was produced in November 1939. What fascinated me in the center pages was a whole series of insights into Polish Jews. I took one picture. The other pictures I thought were a little bit purulent. So I decided just to show one picture, just to give you a mild idea of just how unpleasant the National Socialist idea is towards Jews. But there's something else going on here. If you've thought about what's happened with Karl Escherich in the First World War, with the gas chambers to clean German soldiers, on the same page as this picture was taken, there was a picture of the gas carriages, which were for fumigation, next to the pictures of the Jews. And I think that was a psychological message of a political form directed at the ideology of the war. Now, we do know that extremism took place in 1939 during the that first campaign of the German army. And Alexander Rossino in 2003 produced this book with this horrendous picture of Leni Riefenstahl seeing an execution taking place of a group of Jews conducted by the German army. And at that stage, when I first read that book, I was astonished, A, because of the detail he'd gone into and the research he'd done, but the fact that it had taken so long for us as the academic community to break out how far Riefenstahl had been involved. So she's been making films for Hitler during the war, before the war, then during the war. She's seen this, and to a certain extent, she hasn't said, right, well, I don't want to be part of the system. She carried on. So there is an argument there that as the brutalities start to build, people are getting dragged into them, either forcibly or voluntarily. She was there filming some kind of propaganda film when the shooting took place. But it's not changing the attitudes. They're still continuing to work with the system. So let's move on. So we know what happens in 1940, the German army in combined operations, whatever you want to call it. I've used combined arms doctrine because I've tried to simplify it all the way through the talk here. And we know that the armor and the Air Force working together cleverly did this great attack. I've taken the map from the Eben-Emael Museum complex where the paratroopers crossed the line, landed on the fort, and Hitler gave them all Knight's crosses afterwards. What I found about 1940 was it was a period of a new ideological radicalization of the German army. Now, we've normally thought that 1941 was the process, but I think it was 1940. And there's something interesting there. If there's a radicalization taking place in 1914, 1916, 1918, and the same kind of situations are happening again, how much is the German army replicating its previous behavior? Is it replication or is it continuity? If it's continuity, it's a system. If it's a system, I'm particularly interested because you know I like to understand systems. And for me, I started to see a system. Shall we move on?
Yeah.
So you have comparisons. So you know that the German army is like a maggot eating the whole of Europe. So you've got the goulash Kanonen, which becomes a symbol. And as you can see, it's a symbol in the First World War, it's a symbol in the Second World War. You've got the German soldiers being photographed in the First World War, eating their meal. In the Second World War, there's a huge menu of great dishes. And in the Second World War, they face the audience when they do a dump. And in the First World War, they turn their backs. And in the First World War, they go to brothels. And in the Second World War, the brothels are a little bit more coercive because many of the people who put in the brothels are from Holocaust victims and people from Slavic background. So I noticed then that the radicalization following the failure in 1914 and radicalization following victory in 1940 showed it doesn't matter the conditions in which the German army is, if you like, becoming more radicalized in war. It's actually the system that's doing it. So it doesn't matter whether it's victory or defeat or failure or losing or whatever, the system still does it. It's reacting to what's happening in the war. And as the wars become more intense, then the process of radicalization of the troops is increasing. So we move on.
Yeah.
So we get to a stage in the fighting where something's got to break, and it's either doctrine or ideology. And back in the day when I was spending an awful lot of time on German military history, I was looking at the movements of the infantry. And okay, I've had various people tell me that infantry regiments could move at 3 miles an hour to 5 miles an hour, whatever. What was interesting about a story I came across was the fact that several of the people involved in the incident, which took place at the Battle of Smolensk in July 1941, was both sides, both parties wrote about it. So Guderian, who we know, and Hermann Geier, who we met in the First World War. Hermann Geier had become, by 1939, one of Germany's top infantry generals, set the rules, had written all about how we're going to do Kanai in the future during the 1920s, instruction manuals, a very fine officer and well respected in the German army. If you look where the black arrow is pointing, he's the commander of the 9th Corps, and the 9th Corps is struggling to get from Orsha towards Smolensk. And it's struggling because parts of it are still fighting in Białysza from the 22nd of June 41, where they've crossed over into the forest which I was studying. They're still fighting there because the Russians haven't stopped fighting. So Geier's got multiple problems. He's got only 3 infantry divisions moving at very slow pace. He's got Russians attacking him from all different angles. And he's got Guderian's corps moving at such a pace that they're almost surrounding Smolensk. How can he keep up? And this is where the two-speed army becomes a problem. And these two, round about the 18th of July 41, end up having a stand-up fight in a battle. And Guderian saying, well, Guy's too mathematical. And Guy is saying, this guy just does not know how to work with large numbers. And so the tension develops and breaks. And I've said it's the end of doctrine because basically Guderian wins the argument. He gets the medals. Hitler puts them both into reserve, but reactivates Guderian very quickly afterwards. Guy disappears into the Führer reserve, and round about 1945, I think, commits suicide on the discovery that one or both of his sons, I think 2 sons, have been killed during the war. And he sees no future because he's now under French command in the area where he's lived, and he committed suicide. But the fact that these two were prepared to have a stand-up fight about German military doctrine in the middle of a battle gives you an idea of how unfinished and unscripted this whole process is. Yeah, they've had the Barbarossa directives, and they've had plans to do Hitler's deeds, and Einsatzgruppen coming up behind the fighting. But the problems inherent to the German army at this stage between the infantry and the new, it's causing tensions, and it finally snapped here in 41. So if we move on. So one thing that's very obvious now, as I've probably shown from going back to 1904, is what happened in Namibia. The mass killings is somewhat replicated by the same kind of German soldiers, infantrymen, fighting in the field in 1941. So you've got there's a connection there. German soldiers aren't trained to kill people specifically. I mean, they kill. I'm talking about, in cold blood. They're taught how to fight, but the orders to kill people are pretty clear, and they'll do it because an order is an order, and away they go. The same function of dealing with captives followed from the same time as Namibia. So you see in Namibia the poor captives of the Herero in chains, in captivity in the German army. You see the Russian soldiers in the First World War being marched to Białowieża camp, where they're going to be fed on meager rations, and 20% of them are going to die. And then you see them in the Second World War, these masses of 3.3 million German soldiers who are slaughtered simply by starvation and sent to Auschwitz and all manner of evil horrors. I mean, it is a huge crime. And, I put Christian Streit's book, because the first time I came across this was around about 1990, and he was one of the first of the German historians to expose what the German army had done in the Second World War. Jürgen Zimmer, now I can mention his book because I think it's more prominent here than it was in the Namibia book. He's written about what happens in the Windhoek occupation of Namibia and traced it to Auschwitz. And it was thanks to his research that he kindly passed to me that I was able to put together the first chapter of my book, Hitler's Bandit Hunters. So there's a little connection there. Obviously, with the work that I'm doing now on Białowieża and the labor camps in the First World War, I will be still examining the treatment of the Russian prisoners. I mean, some of the pictures I've got quite horrendous, but it's only fair that the publisher gets first dibs on those. So I'm showing less of them. So if we move on. Now, this was probably the most, well, it's hard to describe how shocking this was when we first came across it. And that was being able to map the lethality of the Luftwaffe operations in Białowieża in the Second World War to almost the same operations in the First World War. And this comparative spatial analysis showed me that in the same terrain, almost to an overlay, the German soldiers are doing exactly the same things, slightly different targets, animals, partisans, civilians, as opposed to Jews, partisans, and the odd bit of hunting on the side. They're far too close. And up to this stage in the talk, as perhaps people are becoming aware now, I have actually tried to go from my First World War research and reach my book, Birds of Prey, with the sole purpose of having a trajectory. What I was astonished about was that after we produced GIS maps, the Geographical Information System maps that Bettina very kindly makes for me, she was able to do, I think, 60 maps for the First World War, because there was obviously more information and more capability than the 37 or 40, I think, for Birds of Prey. But the fact that we could overlay them as continuity between two regimes was staggering.
Mm.
The moment that we got to that stage, the whole project shifted round. You know? And then lethality becomes something deeper, something more harsh to discuss. I'm not going to go into greater detail because I'm going to keep it for the book, but that was the warning shock, that the information that we was receiving from the qualitative data was producing such finite results of, profound importance. So if we move on.
Crikey, yeah.
As you know, I spend a lot of time looking at strategic decision making, mostly because it's what I did when I did my first degree. And I've always, you talk about Hitler as his strategic indecision has caused no end of problems in the German army. These are pictures taken of the period up to and during Stalingrad. And you can see Hitler's face, but you can also see the general's face. I mean, Jodl looks utterly pissed off at the idea that this corporal is telling these generals how to run a war. Now, the reason why I put these pictures here is that, charismatic ideology without doctrinal restraint. The problem is there's no general in either of these rooms who's prepared to turn around to Hitler and say, you haven't got a clue of what you're doing. Stop before we lose
Hitler, you haven't got a Scooby. Shut it. Yeah. Right.
This is where the German generals, this is the point when the German generals fail. So there's all these stories about how bad Stalingrad is, the fighting. I understand all of that. But we get to this point in the history because the German generals don't have a backbone. They haven't got the courage to stop this. They haven't had the courage anyway. And repeatedly in the First World War, they've found themselves doing the most irresponsible things, which have led them into, cul-de-sacs, blind alleys. The same thing happens again in the Second World War. So you've got this continuity. Yeah. Falkenhayn leads the German armies to some kind of attritional death at Verdun. These idiots are going to lead the German army to the ultimate catastrophe at Stalingrad. Yeah. And Hitler is the man in charge, and we can say he's responsible. And we know that what that leads to in the 21st century when the royals go off the rails. But when we look at Hitler today and say, well, he should have known better, he should have allowed the generals to do it. No, the generals should have turned around at some point and said, you're not winning the war, this isn't succeeding. And because they didn't, and let's face it, the most lethal army in the world couldn't get rid of a 56-year-old man, a vegetarian, but they could do it from previously. So, and then we end up with the story of Stauffenberg trying to kill the man and all the rest of it. But for me, the story of where the German army goes off completely off the rails is the indecision and failures at Stalingrad. And this is where that industrial army now is not fit for purpose. That's my argument. Yeah, it's an industrial army and it hasn't developed from its industrial past. So it's like a rusty old belt of rotten old factories that are useless and no good to anybody. Pull them down. And they're trying to carry on with the same old nonsense. And that's why you get into the mess that they get into. So if we move on. So I just wanted to show you this because part of it is the propaganda that was being, I talked about Goebbels before, but the propaganda of the infantryman fighting, raw-handed with his spade smashing the top of a Russian tank in the black and white picture, the image of the German soldier in the steel helmet, they died so Germany may live. All of this propaganda now is shifting because the situation is so grave. Hitler knows that if he doesn't win the war in the East, he doesn't have the resources to continue fighting the war because industry will collapse. And the system isn't going to carry on because it can't supply the kind of equipped forces to fight the war that they've set themselves up to fight. Do you see the conundrum? They've set themselves up to fight a war that eventually they can't fight because they haven't got the capability to do it. So now you have to radicalize the masses and turn the German army into some kind of killing machine it's just going to hold the line. Well, okay. Well, it's not trench warfare. Somewhere along the line it's going to break, and it keeps breaking. They keep repairing it, but the system's breaking all the time. And this is the point when those multiple fractures that literally destroy the German army. That's why Stalingrad's important. That's why they always go back to the Stalingrad was the breaking the back of the German army. But it is because it sends out all these fractures and the whole system goes down the toilet. Takes time, takes 3 years, but it starts there. But if you look back, it started in 1914 because they haven't changed in the psychology of the military thinking. So if we move on. So to compensate, they get workers to work harder. So, for example, the slave laborers who are working in Dachau on German rifles, they go from a 67-hour week to a 75-hour week, and their rations are cut because there's less food around. In the Feldkommandanturs, in the occupied areas where the German army is trying to feed itself. And remember, it's these Russian peasants who are going to create the fodder to feed the horse-drawn army. They're actually pushing them harder. And of course, once they get an opportunity to flee, many of the Russians flee to the partisans. So the Germans create an even greater problem by imposing extreme measures on the economic system, which is slave labor. The slave labor start rioting. And in Cologne, much of the slave labor, at one point, the slave labor actually formed bandit operations and start fighting the SS in the streets of Cologne. I mean, that's where we're getting to. It's like an anarchy starts to impose itself on the German military system. And yet the German army is oblivious. It carries on fighting this war without any kind of relationship to what's going on elsewhere. It at times, you wonder how on earth the whole thing was held together. We know now why, but you're looking at it, you're reading forward, you're not using hindsight. You're just wondering how on earth they put that together. So we move on. So I've used Goebbels' famous "Let the storm break loose" just to point out here, to compensate for the fact that you're not going to get enough tanks and armor, you raise the lethality of the infantry. And they do that with Panzerfausts and STG 44s and the 98K rifle, which is a very, very good rifle and very efficient for German military operations. But again, the whole process is really based on the idea of an industrialized army. It's not a modern mechanized, like American, Russian, British army by 1943-44. It's got these little points like the panzer divisions, but they can't be in all places all at the same time. So to compensate for that, you make the German infantryman more lethal than he was by providing him with Panzerfausts and more STG 44s or MP 44s or 42s and the whole process.
Yeah.
But effectively, the system is now beginning to break down.
It's a facade, isn't it? I mean, that's what it always comes up on this channel. There's that some of those writers back in the 80s and 90s were talking about the lethality of Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks and things like that, and counterattacks as being kind of sexy but the point is it's their only option, and it's a facade. You know, they're competing against the USA, Britain, Canada, etc., with this huge, great shaft of the spear behind its infantry. So and Robin Pryor made that point, even if, and I don't believe it anyway, even if man for man, the German infantryman was better than the British or American infantryman, it doesn't matter any. It doesn't. Who gives a flying fuck? It's not an infantryman against infantryman. It's a system against another system.
That's right. And I mean, to a certain extent, I'm quite impressed with the capability of the German infantryman, given the circumstances as it goes through, like Operation Bagration, and all of those, where they respond in a way which is fascinating to learn from as military historians. But actually looking at the performance level of the German army, is we are now in, you know, we're in the soup. So if we move on. So the Kampfgruppe, everybody likes to talk about the Kampfgruppe. They form Kampfgroups round infantry. I know that's a shock because everybody wants to know about Kampfgruppe Piper, but it's the infantry that's the main force, and the infantry never changes its doctrine. And I've used the 3 pictures here to give an idea. Yeah, they are standing around tanks as they arm up, but look at the lethality of the weapons they're now carrying as opposed to 1940. They march with their Sturmgeschütz. They don't go in lurries quite often. They're spaced out. They're ready to fight. And then at the key moment, it's the infantry that counterattacks or takes the ground. And that's the point when they transition from, I don't know what you would call it. Napoleonics, it would be, you know, from column into line before you fire your muskets. The German soldier is the fastest soldier to transition from doing nothing to violence.
Right.
So you want to talk about discipline. The point of discipline in the German army is this moment. That's that transition. And the German soldier, when forced to, that transition is faster than any other army. And that's why I would say that's the difference. Okay, you're going to have another system come along, but for a moment, the German army shock is still more aggressive than I think any of the Allied armies. And that gives him an advantage. That keeps him in the war a lot longer, but it's not going anywhere. It keeps you in the war, but you're draining infantrymen at such a rate. We're now getting into those serious numbers, you know, where they're losing millions in a year. And that the reason is because you're so heavily reliant on an infantry army, it's taking the attrition because you're trying to use it to plug the gap in mechanized warfare.
Yeah.
The mechanized warfare isn't working very well. And in this sense, I took Hermann Balck, who we saw before with the little red square around his face. If his memoirs, and I particularly like his memoirs and would recommend people reading them, Ordering Chaos, which he wrote in the 80s, if they are correct, he made 3 comments about German mechanized warfare. And those were divisions like the Großdeutschland and the 1st SS Panzer Division and all the big elite ones, as they're called, were too armor heavy. They were inefficient in operations and they struggled with an inner mindset problem. Now, if that's the case, that tells you why you've got the fight going on between Geyer and Guderian back in 1941, and why somebody like him will do better with the 11th 11th Panzer Division than he would with the Großdeutschland, because the Großdeutschland is a corps and it's very lumpy, hard to move and push around and do stuff. But with the 11th Panzer Division, he's able to be more flexible, faster move, and he built a reputation as being a very aggressive counterattack commander of mechanized warfare. But I think the lessons that he teaches are very interesting, and they're often overlooked by those who want to go on about the Panzer Divisions being the greatest and all that good stuff, which frankly I don't agree with. The German army Panzer Divisions, for me, outperformed the Waffen-SS, but I've said this many, many times.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've heard me say, I think another one of the big disasters of the Wehrmacht was allowed the Waffen-SS to expand the way it did. So that was another weakness in the German way of war, but we're not doing the SS today. So if we move on. So we're back to unpleasantnesses. In March 1944, General Joseph Harper comes along with the idea that he's going to take all the slave laborers, whether they're suffering from typhus, sickness, children, women, old men, whatever. He's going to push them into an area of wilderness, and then he's going to let the troops move away, and these 20-odd thousand people will struggle in the wilderness to live or die. It's the destruction of the labor force, and it's conducted by the German army. Yeah, this isn't the SS doing this stuff and Hitler coming along and doing the orders. This is German military logic to deal with a problem, which is all of these typhus-ridden poor civilians who've been slave labor and abused are going to be taken to a frozen waste and just literally left to die. No food, no supplies, no water, no place to sleep, just literally exposed until they pass. Similar to what happens to a certain extent with the Herero in 1904 when they're pushed into the desert. The German army will use the terrain if the terrain will kill its enemy before it has to expend bullets. That happens repeatedly. So if we move on. And then, of course, the ultimate in 1944 was when this gang form a kind of a Nazi strategic synergy to destroy Warsaw. I mean, in the center of there, I put Valemont, because this time Valemont is that manager of violence who's also an industrialist. So he's got all the brains to know how to run a military industrial model, and he will not speak truth to power. Yeah. That's the quality of these guys. They've got this great education. They've got the great learning. They think they're the best soldiers, the most supreme, but put to the test, instead of standing up and saying, this is what we need to do, this guy, he plays the politics. He nearly got hung for it. Anyway, as we know, from the paper from the talk I gave on Warsaw and the Warsaw Uprising, it's a pretty atrocious story. There was an attempt to get doctrine back by calling it Tannenberg and surrounding the Russian army. But by that stage, the Russians believed Ultra and weren't prepared to go into Warsaw. And there's all the political arguments with that. But what actually happens afterwards is the most serious, when the German army just unleashes hell on Warsaw and the SS join in, and it's quite extreme, as we know. So if you move on. So meanwhile, on the Western Front, Bunny Panchev, I've mentioned him before when I did the Auftragstaktik chat with Rick and yourself. He's been interviewing all of these German soldiers that have been captured at Normandy, about 4,400 files, I think, at last touch. And I, for my sins, have been going through them. They're mostly all arms. But what interests me about what he does is he first of all looks at morale. And let me tell you, in all of the interviews and assessments of the German army, there is no mention of Auftragstaktik. Okay, so, put that one aside. What he did notice was the German regiments that were coming forward, the fresh regiments that were coming out as a consequence of Himmler taking over the recruitment system. Many were being filled with camp inmates. So now the German army is using the camps as recruitment centers to fill the ranks because they're running out of manpower. And it was he who starts to make the assumption within the British military thinking that the German army is instrumental to Nazism, and he wasn't believed. Yeah, and it's quite a story, and he ends up running a trial for a concentration camp, which was run by the German army, and his knowledge of the German army's behavior in the Second World War is quite remarkable. And yeah, I'm kind of hopefully the manuscript that I started a few years ago on that should be ready. I promised his missus that I wouldn't publish a book until she'd passed, because he and her were both MI6 officers and I didn't want to embarrass them in any way. So I kept to that promise, and hopefully that's the book after this one. So if we move on, slightly complicated one, we're back to the Rhineland. So I started with the Rhineland and we're back to the Rhineland. And as the British and American armies are moving forward, the green and the blue, there is an area called Wehrkreis 6, which is Military District 6, which is activated. Now, the strategic advantages for Hitler is the internal lines now governing Germany's defense and defending the Rhineland circumvent Allied bombing. So if you take out Dusseldorf, Harris takes out Dusseldorf or somewhere, you just send the trains in a different direction and it's not a problem. And even if the main lines are cut in 3 places at once, they can rebuild the lines because they're now so good at doing it in less than 3 days. So the German army gets a new kind of mobility. So the steam trains, and all of that, when I've been telling you in the past and you've all had a laugh, the railways now support the movement of troops from this military district to decisive points. And the green area is Arnhem and the blue area is Aachen. And because the telephone network is negating ultra, the Allied armies don't know how much is coming at them from various places. And so basically, although Himmler is in command of the home base army as a power base, the actual generals and commanders who are running the field operations have got the benefit of all of this power coming for them, which they then use quite aggressively against Montgomery and Bradley. So if we move on. Just to mention that I've done some substacks on those battles, and Aachen I used various discussions, opened up various things. One of them was Lawton Collins and why 7th Corps had problems taking Aachen and advancing. And in those groups of stories which are on my Substack page, there is the story of Field Marshal Model. And Model is very interesting because he kind of drags the German army back to fighting the German army way, using the internal lines which he's able to take advantage of to its most aggressive force. And he blunts the Allies in Arnhem and Aachen, basically with Maskarovkas, disguises and decoys. And then one day I was merrily looking through some archives, as you do, and I came across a report by Felix Steiner. promise this is the only time I mention an SS man. He writes a working paper for Oberkommando Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Armed Forces, in which he puts together a new idea for pushing the German army in a new direction. And he actually argues that you've got to have small fighting groups with Panzerfaust and MP40s and, you know, all the machine guns, and that these more small fighting units are going to be more effective because there's greater control over them, and you can run a different kind of discipline. Unfortunately, it comes too late and the war ends. Anyway, we move on. So if you look at the propaganda, and I'm going back again now to Goebbels' Newsweeks and his stuff that he does on weekly programs on German cinema, you will see that the system is pretty much what it was back in 1914, slightly updated with new weapons, but old men are now fighting the Volkssturm. The three wizened veterans in the corner, that photograph was taken apparently in April 1945. There ain't many of them left now. Even though all of these pictures are 1945, it's still horses, it's still Stukas, it's mostly infantry, and they're now fighting in Germany and with nowhere to go. So the system in itself has literally killed itself. That's the German way of war. They've created a methodology which eventually will destroy itself because it hasn't got the capability of fighting anymore. Doesn't matter how good those veteran soldiers are, and you can tell they're probably very good, they're just exhausted. Because there's nothing coming in behind to change them, and they're not getting rotation because there's nowhere to rotate to. So it's a system that's dying and has been since Stalingrad, and now we're meeting the inevitability of it. If we move on. So now Goebbels comes along and makes this incredible film. He actually takes all of these soldiers out of the line to make this film Holbrooke. And it's very interesting that as a Rhinelander, he goes back to the Napoleonic War. But if you look at the film, the way it portrays, it's actually showing things like digging anti-tank ditches, Aachen, 1944, the raising of the Volkssturm, 1944, the destruction of Dresden, 1945. If many German, and I don't think many did, but the Germans who would see this film would recognize these pictures, and that there was a comfort, and the comfort is this happened in the past and Germany survived, and Germany will survive again. And that's the story at the very end of the war. This film is made, I mean, it's banned in most places, but it's the last message of the Nazis of how we won the war. And it's, well, you know, it's all symbolism.
Yeah.
So the war ends, and all of these good people now start writing books about how the war was. But remember this, the moment that they start writing their books, the last year of the war, with what happened at Ozorichi and Warsaw, is literally fresh within people's memory. And so you've got books that are being written in the light of that, and they're crafting a myth of the German army, which is a never happened history. So you've got people like Rundstedt who think somehow he's going to write his memoirs and it's going to be as popular as Hindenburg in 1918, 1920. Well, it's never going to happen. And in the story of recreating this German myth of the Wehrmacht in the Second World War, funny enough, the wives start getting involved and taking photographs of the generals and their staff and creating albums, picture albums of the good old days. So you've got pictures of generals and guys who've been involved in the most heinous crimes being regaled as the greatest generals of all time of an army that should have won the Second World War, but it was betrayed by Hitler. Well, actually, I think it's a different story, but anyway. The Lanza story is left to people like, Hans Helmut Kirst and Willy Heinrich. And Willy Heinrich, we know, is Cross of Iron, which is why they've got what's-his-face on the front.
James Coburn, the sidebar noticed James Coburn there, yeah.
The thing that interests me was Null Fumsane 0815, which is named after a machine gun, which also means in German colloquialism, average or below average day. Those stories of that book never really met any kind of popularity in Britain. And yet those stories are very accurate to Wehrmacht way of life, German army way of life, how the barracks worked and all the rest of it. And it's almost, if you look at some of the German shows of that on television and film from the 1950s, you do get a sense that the German army was being restored. The Lanza was being restored in popular culture, which of course goes against the idea of, not just the crafting myths about the army. There's a different story developing. So if we move on. So I produced this for you because I know how much you praise Heinz Guderian.
Oh, I love talking about him. There's no one I prefer talking about of all the arseholes. He's my favorite.
So I crafted this. This is for you because I think your shows are wonderful and the work that you've done for history. So this is a little tribute to Woody. And what I did here was, there's Guderian, not being a Panzer general, talking in March 1945 to the masses about what a great Führer he is and how we're going to win the war and all the rest of it. And then a little bit later, there he is, sat there in his semi-camouflage jacket with various war criminals in Nuremberg. But the thing that I discovered back way when I was working in America was a file in which it showed that the draft outline for Panzer Leader was actually drafted in July 1945 while in US captivity by American soldiers. 1947, he was on the point of being extradited to Warsaw for his part in the Warsaw atrocity, and the US Army saved him. But, hindsight being what it is, he ends up as a plastic G.I. Joe figure.
Mm-hmm.
So that was for you. So if we move on. So this is my summary. Strategic failure through professional incompetence. You have military excellence failed by leadership and managers of violence. German army military capability is rapid transition to violence. As I said, they're fantastic at making that shift from not fighting to fighting, that move. Infantry was standardized expertise, so it follows the same doctrine every time. They fight the same way, time in, time out. But it's an industrialized army. It never becomes a modern mechanized force, even though it has panzer divisions. The 10% of the German army's panzer divisions does not replicate what actually happened to the other 90%, which was the infantry. It's a system of systems, so you have NCOs running one system, and it's not like the British Army NCOs or the American Army. There is literally almost an army of NCOs of many, many ranks that power a middle ground between the ordinary soldier and the officer. And that gap isn't the comfort zone that you get with the Allies, where NCOs and link the officers to the infantry or the basic ordinary soldier. What it is, it's like a cushion that keeps the officers away from the Lancers, because there's so many NCOs that are cushioning that break. So NCOs have a different role, and to a certain extent, they're the cause of the harsh discipline. And that's why I said the overpowering discipline. I call them lethal, but no moral compass. And I think that's really the nature of what happened with the German army in the 20th century, or the first half of the 20th century.
Yep.
There we are.
I can't argue with that. And there for your needs, folks, are all the how to get more. If you've now just have your first listening to a Dr. Phil Blood presentation, now you want more, there is stuff being pumped out on a very regular basis on your Substack. And there you can also check the previous shows Phil has done on the channel, which cover some of the stuff and go down different avenues as well. So yeah, I mean, we could do lots of questions, Phil, but we're not, because at 2 hours, I think we will leave it there. But you want to say something?
Just go back to that screen?
Of course we can.
A Genius for Evil: The Colonial Origins of Auschwitz and Modern German Politics is published by Hearst & Co. sometime this year. And you've seen the research.
Brilliant stuff. I mean, you said you were going to announce that, and I forgot to put that back up there again. And I think I always have these multiple takeaways from my discussions with you, Phil, both the ones we have publicly and the ones we have kind of privately. And I think historiography keeps coming into my head again, how much of the imagery, how much of our understanding is kind of flawed in that post-war era. I think when I think of the first British veterans I met, they were kind of cynical and grumpy about the war, and they grumbled about the tea and the food, and they didn't really want to get into motivations and all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, we were getting all those Ballantyne's books of all the pictures of Panzer IIIs nipping across the steppes and things like that. And of course, there's the whole NATO thing, where the issue of maintaining the idea that less better stuff is a better concept than more plentiful stuff, and the Warsaw Pact NATO thing. But I think a lot of what you're discussing is you're reversing in a sense, and Alan Allport, other people like that, are reversing it as well. This sort of 20 or 30 year period after the war, where we kind of went down we were led down the wrong path of how to understand the war that the countries had just lived through, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very much so. And Little Hart, it's easy to say, Little Hart is a devious man. It's not so much that he's a devious man, it's the fact that he couldn't imagine the war that was being fought because he never saw it. I think the British soldiers saw it and were shocked by it, and I think they discovered there was another kind of life which was so unpleasant, they didn't want to take that home.
Yeah.
And I think they struggled with it. And the more we look at the way that war panned out and the horror of it, the more we find it's understandable that people like my Uncle Stan and Jim and the others who fought that all the way through from beginning to end came home and they were in such a terrible state. I mean,
yeah,
I can well understand it. There is a point in Bunny Panchev's story in which he writes to himself and tells what he's seen, and it's so horrendous. You can understand why these guys were never the same afterwards. They went to war and seriously psychologically damaged.
Yeah.
Because that's the lack of moral compass that the German army, the way it's fought its war and the way it's behaved and the way it's represented Germany, the absence of moral compass has left a stain on everybody who's had to fight them.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point. The Allies who discover the horrors by being in the same presence of it to some extent. They're not guilty of it, but they're affected by it. They're part of it, and it become, or more correctly, it becomes part of them. I think, again, you've made a very, very, very good case about the point. We mustn't separate military history from Holocaust history, and we mustn't separate the study of, I guess, mental health from the study of a war of this size and horror. You know, we must all remind ourselves that, as fun as it can be to talk about the different thicknesses of armor on certain armored vehicles and look at the performance and velocities and gun against gun, and we all can be guilty of that to some extent, at the heart of it is this terrible, terrible conflict that killed millions, made thousands homeless, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands homeless, and left all those who lived through it deeply scarred by it. And we mustn't forget that.
And the Germans themselves are deeply scarred by it. I mean, the veterans I met and the families, and then the families afterwards. I mean, to imagine that there are psychological treatments even today for families who are second, third generation German soldiers, families of German soldiers, having to take psychological treatment because of what actually happened to them through the behavior of the soldiers coming home, their behavior, their breakdowns, their PTSD, all of that stuff. It's horrendous. I mean, I deal with that stuff cautiously, by the way. I'm just saying I deal with that stuff cautiously because having listened to a German psychologist talking about how they have to treat those people, was astonishing, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, guys, for spending 2 hours.
No, it's flown by. And it's like, you know, it's like we all understand that we're going down a massive rabbit hole, but there are hereditary diseases, hereditary conditions, hereditary traits that humans pass on. I think guilt transfers. It shouldn't, but it does. I think, you know, I've met, you know, I met Himmler's daughter at We Have Ways a couple of years ago, and that's her whole thing in her life, is addressing the fact that she is related to someone who was so monstrous. Or was it her granddaughter now? I forget, maybe granddaughter. And you know, guilt shouldn't transfer, but it does, doesn't it? It inevitably, you look at what your parents and your grandparents did, and you think, shit, is part of them in me? Is part of what they did part of my DNA? Anyway, we're going down a massive great thing. Folks, what we'll do is we will schedule Dr. Phil for just a Q&A, I think. So many questions came and went, and you addressed them. I think we'll just bring you on one day if you'd like to, and just put questions to the governor. Governor Q&A.
I'm really sorry, because I planned it for 50 minutes and I hadn't realized that we were going so long. I'm really sorry.
I realized I didn't care because it was great. No, it's been fantastic. So folks, consider becoming a patron. Check out Dr. Phil Blood's Substack. Check all my guests' Substacks and accounts and social media, etc., etc. But folks, there's nothing tomorrow because I've had to postpone the show with Anand Toprani because he's got that snowstorm hitting him where it is. That's now scheduled for March the 5th. But we're talking about Spitfires on Friday, and Thursday we are talking about 3 men who fought in the 8th Air Force with someone from the 8th Air Force Museum over in the USA. So I will see you all then on Thursday. Thank you, Dr. Phil. Thank you, viewers, for your insightful comments and additions. I will see you all again. Cheers. Bye.